So yung nakita ko na yung bangka, yung pumasok na yung dagat sa nakita ko na ganyan. So pagtingin ko sa mga tao ko, mga kasama ko na 6, di sad, umiiyak sila, umiiyak. Sabi niya, ano nang gagawin natin? Sabi ko sa kanila, huwag kayong matakot, huwag kayong matakot. Magpanalangin lang tayo sa Diyos. So naisip ko, yung boss namin, before we sail, he give me a sat phone in the back. So, kinuha ko yun at inon ko. Pero no, walang siya load. So, after 5 days, I turn on. Oh, I hope the miracle, they call me. Doon so that, then after I on, 1 hour to 2 hours, they call. I'm crying.
After we provided the credit, we still couldn't get the exact location of the 7 fishermen because they don't know how to do that. We contacted YASAD, and after that, we relayed the message to the captain of the ship, and they were able to do the steps that we provided and extract the location, and that is the time that they were able to provide the location to the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard.
And I mean, they went through so much in the past few days that they were drifting on sea, and that phone, the technology that was used to give their location, gave them a glimmer of hope. So for Christmas, hearing their story really means a lot to me.
Thank you all for joining us here today. We are at, look at that, Collapsing Time and Space, Technology and Climate Smart Disaster Response. What's really exciting we have today is 3 people that I think this panel will all really benefit from, because it's showing the 3 synergies that are out there that can actually help collapse time and space. You've got the international non-governmental organization, you've got the satellite company, and then you've got the professor doing the research on the ground. So all 3 of these folks, who by the way, none of us have ever met before, we don't work together, this is all, we're just here telling you about how these 3 people work, but they work with other people similar in their industries and their countries. But you'll see it, maybe a business relationship develop after this today. So won't you welcome Khalid El-Kaf, Chief Operations Officer at El Yasat, and tell us a little bit about yourself. You'll do it better than me.
Thank you, Rasha. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Khalid El-Kaf. I am the Chief Operations Officer of Yasat Group. Yasat is an elite UAE flagship satellite operator. We cover 2/3 of the world, which means 1 billion of population. It's including Middle East, Africa, Asia Pacific, and more. Part of our satellite communication services, we provide broadband, we provide mobility, we provide some product that is used by the vessels. And I'm so proud every time I see this video, I get that tickle because our initiative that maybe later on we'll mention it, saves these fishermen when they get lost in the sea.
It's really impressive, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I see you tearing up. I mean, it is an incredible thing that you do, and thank you. And now we have David Nicholson. He's the Chief Climate Officer of Mercy Corps. Tell us about yourself in 30 seconds or less. No pressure. Just kidding. You have a minute.
Thank you, very generous. So David Nicholson, I'm the Chief Climate Officer for Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is a global humanitarian and development organization. We work in 42 countries around the world. We have about 6,000 staff embedded in communities all over the world, seeking to help communities build, improve their development trajectory, improve their food security, water security, economic opportunity in the face of climate change. So trying to find out ways, how do we help communities build their capacity to adapt to climate change and be prepared for the disasters that are coming.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Samia Salim, Director and Professor, Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh. Tell us about yourself, Doctor.
Thank you. So I had a large Center for Sustainable Development at a private university in Bangladesh, and my research the last 8 years in Bangladesh, action research mostly, has been working with climate vulnerable communities across the country, looking at aspects of adaptation, vulnerability, resilience, a lot on disaster preparedness. But what really I wanted to add to that is the last few years I've also been working with one of the largest NGOs in Bangladesh, Sajida Foundation, and who primarily also work in Bangladesh on health, finance, poverty, and I've been working with the communities that they are working with, applying these action research and knowledge into how to actually prepare communities, minimize risk, and mobilize that support needed after disaster.
That's amazing. We'll talk a little bit more how we can weave in all three of your roles into everything. This is really interesting where you're doing the research on the ground, and that in turn affects the technology, which brings me to Khalid. And so, Khalid, satellite technology plays a crucial role in disaster preparedness and response. Can you elaborate a little on the specific instances where the use of satellite data has proven instrumental in reducing risk and enhancing disaster relief efforts?
So this is an excellent question. So as per the WMO and the Union for Disaster Risk Reduction, they claim that for the last 50 years, sudden disaster or sudden what we call natural disaster is increasing. And we're talking about, for example, earthquakes, we're talking about storms, we're talking about floods, tsunami. When such a disaster happens, it's impacting the infrastructure, it's impacting all the terrestrial communication. People get lost at that time. Organizations try to go through the normal process that they agreed on, but there is no kind of update and communication. And here is where YASAT or any satellite operator are well positioned to provide communication, or we call it critical communication during the natural disaster. You saw now the fishermen, this is a natural disaster, they get lost in the sea and they need communication. And by using at that time Thuraya, which is the YASAT, the mobility arm, they managed to contact us, or we managed to reach them, and then we pass the information to the organization to reach them. You take another example that when disaster happening and impacting, for example, infrastructure of a school, impacting the transportation, then teacher or student, they cannot reach and get their education, right? So after disasters happening, here the critical communication of satellite operators such as YASAT can provide communication and let them get the e-learning, or can give the hospital, for example, to send the information of that impacted area. In 2022, using YASAT Save Lives, we managed approximately 128 people get help or support during their disaster.
Khalid, can I just back up for a second? Yeah. You just mentioned something about YASAT Saves Lives. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
So in 2022, in YASAT, we kicked off an initiative called YASAT Saves Lives. The initiative is mainly that internally during disaster, if somebody is approaching us, we have an end-to-end governance how to respond during that contact, or whoever is contact us during crisis when they are in the coverage of YASAT. So we have an SLA, how to respond, how to give the service, how to enable. Sometimes, for example, while we are monitoring the weather and we see there is a potential storm hitting Asia Pacific, we start giving more power from our satellites so the communication doesn't get impacted and they get the services there. So using that YASAT Save Lives, the fishermen, the video you just saw it is an example. We had other example that we save people, and when we say saves people, that means we give them services, or we pass the information to organizations so they can rescue them or to give them whatever helps they need.
Excellent. Okay. That kind of segues into Dr. Salim, like when we're talking about climate disaster, how does research help that? I know you also deal with end-to-end. You do the research, you do the training for folks. How does that research play into all of this risk mitigation?
So that's a really good question, because the research kind of helps to look at end-to-end from the beginning, from risk minimization, preparedness, looking at how communities are coping, diversifying the risks. But then when disaster strikes, and having been in Bangladesh the last few years, we've had a number of, some of the largest floods, 3 massive cyclones, and being able to apply some of the findings of that research from looking at preparedness to how do you mobilize the information, we might get from satellite or technology. And what we found is having really good, strong networks on the ground, having that really like high-tech communications where, just for an example, Sajida Foundation has a Field Force app where through the app you're able to mobilize not only what one group is doing, but across the country, how do you really bring in that coming together so you can minimize risk and really reach to the people who need it very quickly, whether it's help with health, whether it's water, food, whatever it may be, to be able to mobilize quickly, get that information. And this is after the disaster. There's obviously research that shows what is needed before the disaster, and then, as you mentioned, after it's over, lives are saved. It doesn't end there. There's rebuilding. There's and different people. You put in context requires different kinds of support. One solution doesn't apply to all. So you really need that know-how from the ground and good communication, good networks where it's not just one entity doing it, but collectively different, whether it's government together, not just whether government, private sector, NGOs that needs to come together to see what support is needed to minimize.
That's incredible. So you're taking public sector, private sector, you've got government workers, NGOs. How do you do that? How many of you have an army of people there?
Strong networks using, apps, using digital space technology, information. That's really where all this really has to come together to help. The thing is happening on the ground, but that, to bring it together, that massive question comes from use of such technology, use of satellite data, use of information, and networks to bring it to where it's needed.
Okay, and then from the beginning of what you do, taking it now to pivot a little, but really the same, dealing with David and Mercy Corps, you're taking a lot of that research, you're taking the technology, and you're saving lives. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, communities have been responding to disasters for millennia, right? So the last 20 years, we've seen two really, really big disruptors. One is climate change, and the other is the emergence of all these technologies. And I think there's obviously challenges in climate change. We're at COP, that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And then there's lots of opportunities presented by the sorts of technologies that we've been hearing about here. The way Mercy Corps thinks about this is as much as possible, we want to bring these technological solutions to communities in advance of extreme weather. We know that more disasters will happen. We know that climate change will increase the intensity and frequency of different kinds of shocks and extreme weather events in different parts of the world. So the question is, how do we utilize all of this incredible technology that's been spread? We've got satellites of all kinds flying all over the place, sending down information, getting that information into the hands of people, decision makers at different levels, whether it's national government, municipal government, community leaders, to do things differently, because ultimately adapting to climate change means doing something different, right? It's making a set of different decisions. People have been used to living under certain conditions for hundreds of years. Indigenous knowledge is set in that paradigm, and that paradigm is changing. So we want to make sure people are able to access information at different scales. There's certainly when disaster strikes, right? When disaster strikes, we need all this information to say, let's get collapsing time and space. How do we, as quickly as possible, get information so people can get access to resources, can save lives? Fundamentally important. But even prior to the disaster, how do we make sure there are good triggers in place, right? So that people can anticipate when a extreme event is coming, when a drought season is coming, when these longer term stresses are coming as well. So, and then we can help get resources into their hands so they can do something different, right? To prepare so that they're not exposed to the shock in the same way that they would be without that information to begin with.
So David, for a layman like me, no technology experience, how do you play that into letting the average person understand what you're doing? I mean, is it like robotic arms where you have telemedicine and a doctor's behind the camera and telling one of your volunteers what to do? How make that more real for me?
Yeah, sure. So we work in a lot of food production systems, lots of agriculture areas. We work a lot in northern Kenya where there's lots of livestock rearing. Okay? It's an inherently resilient system, right? People have been walking animals around low rainfall areas for millennia. But they've been facing these incredible drought cycles now, right? They had 6 failed rain seasons in a row up until earlier this year when the rains finally came. So people couldn't go to the traditional pastoral patterns. They couldn't take their animals to the same places as they always used to because it hadn't rained. There was no grass. So we were working with the municipal government to build a GIS lab in Wajir County so that the government workers could have access to up-to-date information from satellites that can actually tell you where is green and where is not. Where is there soil moisture and where is there not? And where might it rain and where is it not going to rain? And then that information can flow into the hands of people who are making those decisions. They have these community rangeland councils. A bunch of elders come together every couple of weeks and say, where should we take our animals? You get that information into their hands. They can then make the decisions to go to where there is grass, where there is pasture, or if there isn't any, they can make the decision to sell their animals. All of this reduces the impact of the disaster to begin with, and that's really what we're trying to do.
Remarkable. I can imagine the amount of work that you have to do outreach in the community on top of that. So that is really fascinating work that you do. And going into that, Khaled, we were talking a little bit about what happened in China, but I'm sure there's many, many more examples. How do you deal with, how do you collapse that time and space in emergency situations? How is it really done? Again, I keep thinking robotic arms and telemedicine, but really, what's going on there to help in these disasters?
So, when natural disasters happen, like an earthquake or let's say storms, all the infrastructure get destroyed, right? So, like mentioned by Dr. Sumaya, that there is what is happening before the disaster and what is happening during the disaster and what is happening after the disaster, because nothing gets stopped at that time. And during the whole sequence, if they have trusted communication is lost, whatever governance they want to use without the technology or the critical communication, then it is not going to work. And here where's our role as YASAT or any satellite operator that have the coverage will do that role. Communication is provided either by the mobility using Thuraya product, either through what we call it the broadband, meaning they can reach the internet, getting the news, passing the information to such an organization like Dr. Sumaya or like David. And then I gave an example about the schooling and the education. Let me tell you another example. The wildfires in 2022, as per the numbers, is getting increased. It's impacted around 10 countries. The impact was 45,000 people or communities get impacted by the wildfires. So imagine that during that disaster, the firefighters, if they don't have trusted communication, satellite is playing a role, and here where YASAT is providing either the mobility, either terminals connecting to their vessel or their what you call it, their transportation, how they are communicating with their HQ, what's happening in the organization. So there is a key role and an important role of satellite communication that provided either data or voice. And always we are saying in YASAT, we are aiming and increasing the awareness that organizations should have in their disaster policies and governance to have satellite communication enabled.
Understood. And so that SAT communication that you have for all these disasters, is it something that you just monitor, even if somebody doesn't have, I guess it's the Thuraya phone, if I'm not mistaken, if somebody doesn't have that SAT phone and they don't have your service, but you have that satellite and you've detected something. Let's say we had an earthquake in the Philippines today. Do you all serve any kind of a purpose in that for people that don't subscribe if you see that disaster with your satellites?
So usually, let's take the Philippines. Let's say they get tsunamis, right? So from the weather news, we have a network operations center 24/7 working and monitoring our coverage, the infrastructure of our coverage, the customer of YASAT, in case they lost communication or they are getting bad quality, so we start giving them the support.
Okay.
So when the question you are asking, are we monitoring the non-subscribe? No, we are monitoring what we call it the area get that disaster. So for example, in the Philippines, when we saw there is tsunamis coming, we increased the power coming from the satellite. And when I say increasing the power, meaning I'm increasing the service availability in case somebody pick up our terminal. Either it's a mobile, either he's connecting to a Wi-Fi terminal that provide internet using our satellite. So their communication doesn't get affected.
That's brilliant. So if I'm essentially bringing it down to the non-tech level, when I travel and my cell phone picks up another cell phone network, essentially, I mean, I know it's different technology, but it's the same idea. They can pick up that band if they need it.
I give you another also example, people that maybe doesn't know about it. So we have a product also, we call it SAT Sleep, meaning you don't need to buy our product of mobile. If you're having iPhone, you're having Android, you just connect it as a cover, and in case you lost communication, you use the satellite communication of Thuraya.
Oh, that's
This is another
brilliant.
example.
Okay,
we are using.
I will
And people
look
are
into it.
using it in these areas.
Okay. I will definitely look into that. I'll track my son with that over there sitting in the front row. Okay. And then so, Dr. Samia, coming back to you, we've heard from everyone here on the panel. Can you kind of bring that into the collapsing time-space theme? Keep thinking of Doctor Who. I don't know how many people here watch Doctor Who, right? I keep hearing like the TARDIS is going to come in here and take you away. You're going to be the new companion of the Doctor. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you're missing out. Start from the David Tennant season. Anyway, that's a personal, that's not a corporate spiel, that's my own. We were joking about this earlier. But in all honesty, how do these two deploy into what you do? Again, I know you do it from end to end, but tell me how it interjects with the satellite companies, the technology, and the NGOs, INGOs.
So I'm going to look at it
Or not.
And yeah, in two ways. First, going back to the research of this, and I guess the role of university and learning in education. I think there's still a gap in how such information is introduced in disaster management plans, and you know, when government in policies, or you know, as we're teaching, or in research. So I think there needs to be more incorporation of, as you said, from a layman's term, explain to me how this works, you know, thinking of robots and robotic arms. I think your average researcher or practitioner working in this space needs to be more familiar with not necessarily, you know, obviously technical back-end jargon, but like really, you know, how can we utilize such technology to, you know, as we're preparing adaptation plans or disaster management plans. So there's one aspect of the knowledge mobilization of how we, you know, bring this knowledge into research systems as we, you know, work on collapsing space and time in disaster management program.
Okay.
But going from the end, seeing it more from NGO actual work on the ground. I think this information also needs to be filtered in context, and that knowledge from the NGOs on the ground, what they're saying. So going back to the fishermen, right? I have one example of you know, using, so in Bangladesh also there's, you know, good early warning signals to get fishermen to come back in when there's cyclones, but you know, there's patches where it's not reaching, right? Or they're like, you know, they've had too many warnings, they cannot come back for various economic, financial reasons. I think you need to bring in that context on the ground of what works from this information. One example, women in particular, right? So that from the work we do inside of the foundation, you know, particular things they need during disaster, during when a disaster happens, or post-disaster, right?
Okay.
So not necessarily all the information they need is captured, and some of that needs to be fed back as we're developing more information systems on you know, tackling disasters. So it needs to be both ways, not just the information we're collecting, but what other information we need to collect to be able to capture all so leaving no one behind, you know, the really most vulnerable, people with disability, people in really remote areas that might not, you know, have those networks to receive this information.
Understood.
Research really needs to also pick up on that and bring the two together of, you know, what other information is needed to have a more holistic, integrated, inclusive disaster management plan that, you know, addresses the most vulnerable.
That's really great, especially that the most vulnerable people that need us, and that's why that technology is so important to have it out there, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Be interesting. I don't know if you spend any time on the R&D aspect of things, like how to improve satellite technology, how to improve broadband technology, any of that preparedness. It'd be interesting to see how that. I'm sure.
I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah.
I think that is really important that we bring in the two together.
Right.
It's not, you know, development and disasters and vulnerable communities, and here you have, like, you know, they really need to have these conversations more, and you know, I think that's something that really should be encouraged to come together.
And I see whoever put this panel together really did some thinking, because I mean, this is exactly what you need during a disaster, right? You can't stop it. Well, we don't have the tech yet for all that, but you know, having people on the ground. And David, I know that you were, you know, we were talking about this earlier, but essentially, What could you say to these folks here from the tech standpoint, from the research standpoint? What do you need more of to do your job from these folks?
So the first thing I'd say is a true Doctor Who fan would probably say start
Yes.
before David Tennant. Like that
Oh,
but anyway,
we'll have a talk
we'll get
after
into that
this
later.
because
We'll get into
I
that later.
don't know. And that person in the audience, no, don't clap for that.
Sorry, I'm trying to remember your question now.
Yeah, I know, right?
But Dr. Salim said something really important for us here that is about, how do we make sure that, there's always an obsession with how far can new technology, what some new things can do for us, and it's we have to be a climate justice lens will tell us we have to be primarily concerned with the most vulnerable, the people who have contributed least to the climate crisis and are the ones suffering the most. And I think it's really important to keep that lens when we're thinking about these systems. One thing we've been doing a lot is, we as an NGO, a response organization, when a disaster strikes, quite often the most effective thing we can do is get cash into the hands of as many people as possible as quickly as possible, right? And they can figure out how they want to use that money to respond. And we do that at significant scale all around the world. We know from research and partnerships with organizations like yours to show that getting money in the hands of people before the disaster is much more impactful. I think the last data that we've seen is $1 spent beforehand on preparedness saves $6 afterwards in response costs. So it's a really significant part of this equation. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're getting as accurate as possible information from the satellite providers that can predict as downscaled as possible so that people know locally when a disaster is coming. We've been doing some research in Central America, a lot of hurricane season, growing intensity of hurricanes. And organizations like ours respond afterwards, give cash out to people. But we're dwarfed actually by the amount of money that comes in from remittances, largely from family in the US that gets sent to people, often very vulnerable people who are connected to platforms. And we've worked with a group called Remitly, which is a company that does those remittance. To do some of this, we did a sort of a pilot to experiment. What happens if, rather than us trying to get money to people, what happens if we alert everybody around the world, largely in the US, who send the remittances to say, hey, we've got money from us, we've got information from our satellite providers, we know this hurricane is going to hit this part of the country, we're about 3 or 4 days out, we will send some money, but you guys send your money now to leverage that as much as possible. And that is a really successful pilot, and we've demonstrated that you leverage so much more money, so much more investment, and gives people the chance to respond much more effectively by working that way. But it needs a couple of things. One, it needs as good information as possible that gets as localized as possible, right? It's not just, there's a hurricane in Guatemala. There is these communities of this coast are most likely to be hit, right? We also need to work with research partners to demonstrate the value of that so this stuff gets integrated into national policy response, right? The role of an NGO like us is to demonstrate this, but ultimately it should be integrated into a national government's response to disaster preparedness. That's where it becomes really effective.
Right. No, that's really important. And then so, for me, okay, I grew up in Florida. We've got our news, hurricanes coming, oh no. We've been trained by similar, what you're doing in Bangladesh, we have in the US telling us, okay, this is what you do. You don't stand by the windows, sleep in the bathtub, did that. So there might be new places to go, but that's back then. But the whole point of this is we had the technology, didn't have iPhones back then, but we knew that something was coming and how to prepare. You're dealing with indigenous populations that may or may not have the Thurea, that may or may not have anything. So you're essentially in the old days, a bell would ring, right? Or the town crier would go around, depending on the country or the place. These folks rely on you to get to them to be there. So you must have that solid technology and then the solid relationship. So it's multifaceted.
The issue of trust is fundamentally important, right? You can have all the accurate information in the world. If people don't trust it, so you have to be a consistent, trusted partner for organizations throughout. You can't just show up 2 weeks before a hurricane and say, hey, everyone, look at us. We got this map.
Right.
You should do something different. They're going to ignore you, right? And
in each country, you have to adapt to each cultural situation and know how to speak to people, right?
Exactly.
And how to approach people.
And that's not me doing that, right? We have...
take the credit for it.
We have teams in country who are from there, who understand the culture, who are figuring out how to work in different cultures and different kinds of shocks. A response to a flood flash or a hurricane is very different to a response to a drought. Right. So it has to be really nuanced and contextual.
So big message from you that not just the technology, but multifaceted, integrating into the indigenous communities, et cetera. So that's great. And I never trusted my weatherman growing up, so... We'll see. Speaking of technology, Khaled, Yasat's role in providing internet services during disasters, we were talking about that is paramount for effective response efforts, right? How has the satellite technology under your leadership contributed to enhancing situational awareness during emergencies?
So, like we heard to Mr. David and the doctor, YASAT as a group, we are working in a long-term strategy how to evolve and upgrade our capabilities, which will be used either by organization like the research or will be used by people and communities. So over the voice mobility we are providing and over the broadband, YASAT is developing the latest capabilities that can be used either by the end user or either by organization. Lately, YASAT signed with Bayanat for a space program to build a satellite, Earth observation satellite, which is really important to provide an effective and accurate information which can be used to predict, for example, a hurricane or some of the natural disasters.
Much better than the weatherman that I had growing up in Florida.
And this program, which is for Earth observation, we are going to build 7 LEO satellite that will give an excellent geo information, which will be passed to various sector and organization, like mentioned by David and Dr. Sumaya.
Okay.
Another thing we are launching very soon, the next generation Thuraya satellite, we call it T4. It will have much bigger bandwidth and speed. It will support new capabilities, new products such as IoT, better P2P, or push to talk. It will give much better, accurate information.
Okay.
And finally, we are working hard in the mobility sector, the Thuraya part, which is our YASAT mobility arm. We are developing and launching new products, especially in the IoT sector, because the IoT is used.
What does that mean?
IoT mean Internet of Things.
Okay.
Okay. So Internet, which will be used either by gas and oil industry. Plus, it can be used for agriculture, for example. So you can put remote sensing for agriculture to track them, to make sure that either they are not getting hunted. So there is a lot of what we call it scenarios that is used for either helping communities or to help us predict natural disaster, to help us during the disaster, and finally to help us after the disaster is gone and the organization or the countries or the communities are developing and to raise up until that moment.
Brilliant. So it's not just, again, we're all talking about this, it's not just non-governmental organizations, governments, it's the average person also. Just simply by having access to that system could be enough to save a life. Hey, I'm here, come get me, like you did with the fisherman. I mean, that is just, remarkable.
So the fisherman, just to let everybody know, he has that product or that telephone since 3 years, but never used it.
Did he looks like he charged it though.
So thank God it was charged at that time,
Right.
at that moment.
Okay.
And part of our internal YASAT Save Lives, which is I explained it before, that we don't, we know the natural end user of the satellite customer. He doesn't use it every time like the normal mobile right now. He uses it only during emergency, during he lost communication and he need communication, and the only available at that time is the satellite.
Right.
So we usually internally we don't suspend non-active subscriber, we
That's
call it,
brilliant.
or not using it, because we know what's the natural using of the satellite operator. So when he switch it on and it capture our coverage immediately, then anything he will do, because he never used it, it reach us, and then it kick off our YASAT Save Lives process internally.
That's brilliant. And then, so one more aspect of it, since for me, all I think of is the telemedicine robotic arm. Is there any of the telemedicine that you all are involved in that, or is there any kind of cooperations with emergency services, doctors, et cetera, on that, or no?
First of all, YASAT is part of the UN Office of the Disaster Charter. We are part of it. This is one. Good. Another example, we are having a partnership with ZAR.net. ZAR is providing online education services, and that agreement to provide 10 areas in Zimbabwe, which cover around 4,500 schools to get e-learning using YASAT broadband services. Because they don't have terrestrial communication in Zimbabwe in these areas.
Okay.
So we signed that partnership just to provide the e-learning services. Of course, satellite communication is used for telemedicine. It can be used during, for example, sending information to research and development in the area doesn't have normal communication. It's used lately. We are experimental how to use it under the water for monitoring the species in case of pollution, all of that. There is a new technology coming using the echo waves that can be connected to our terminal and push it to the satellite to reach to the HQ. So there is a lot of scenarios that is used for either disaster or either to do research and development for the human being evolving or development.
Brilliant. Thank you. And so, Dr. Samia, going into that, do you have specific relationships that you guys cultivate in the beginning, right? And then how does that help you at the end? Like when you're preparing before pre-disaster, kind of walk me through how that means something in reality, right? We've talked scholastically, but like how is that in real life? How does that play out in real time?
So I think that's really the foundation of, if at the end the success is looking how this technology information is used to reduce disasters, the beginning is this foundation, and which we do, at least with the Sajida Foundation and then through our action research at ULab as well, is really building that rapport with the communities and giving that time to do that as well, really trying to get in and understand how they have been coping. As you said, people have been coping with disasters for millennium, so not ignoring all that, taking all that context of their housing, how they grow food, how their social networks, because they're not necessarily, looking into, they have their own networks of relations and patrons and others. So really trying to understand their networks, the resources they mobilize, and the trust, building that. So it's really important to do that. Whether in research, you're not just there to extract knowledge from there to feed into R&D. You're there to have this two-way communication. So keeping that in mind and in practice from a research perspective always. But then even with the program that I helped design, we really brought in a lot on locally led adaptation and making sure that, the communities themselves. So from having community mobilizers, from having leaders within the community to be able to, connect these pieces. So that's really, it's time and trust really,
really
helps.
Important. And so thinking about all of this, what do you think, you're doing all this hard work, but are you interacting with people outside of your country, your city? Like, this is like massive research that you're doing that could help others, right?
Absolutely. So I work with a lot of international partners as well. So, for example, the work we do with fishermen, it's with 12 countries, 6 in Africa, 6 in Asia. Okay. And trying to get this information, what's working in Bangladesh with the fishermen, the fishing community, we're working on early warning signals from them. How does that apply to our, partner from India to Japan to Kenya and other places? So there's a lot of knowledge sharing platforms that need to exist. Yes. I don't know.
I'm assuming that's not a disaster response. I think we're okay from the tsunamis right now. I mean, I don't think that's a warning.
So just really having those. I think those.
I'm with the right people. So. I think we're okay. I just didn't want to. Oh no, they're telling us to exit. Did they say exit? This is what happens in a disaster. You ask somebody, what did they say?
What's the satellite data telling us?
These are like serious things happening. I think we're okay. All right. So look, that's why it's so important. I'm going to bring this home, right? We're going to use this for this panel. It's important that you have knowledge that is catered to you, where you're at, and you can't just plug and play, right? But it's important that you try to share your research your learnings. I mean, David, you do the same, I'm assuming, right? You're all over the world, but you don't just rely on one. You work together with others and spread that knowledge, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And, actually, the knowledge coming out of Bangladesh over decades has been at the forefront of this stuff because it's a country that's always dealt with emergencies, right? Always dealt with flooding. It's one of the most extreme places for climate crisis. So this sort of research that we've been talking about absolutely influences the rest of the world. Everything has to be contextualized, right? But yeah, this stuff gets spread around pretty consistently.
Absolutely. Look, I like to make light of situations. This is obviously a very serious topic. People's lives are on the line. These folks are here from a tech perspective, from a research perspective, from an open hearts perspective, saving lives. And so I just kind of want to just get final thoughts from you all. Now, we're off script now. Forget about it after that. But Khalid, we'll kind of go down the line. Final thoughts from you.
So, final thoughts. First of all, I'm encouraging all organizations and communities who's working in building disaster governance or policy. You need to make sure satellite communication is part of that governance. Because when disaster is happening, you don't know what's happening. People first, the panic behind it, people how they are working together or communicating with each other. They have to make sure satellite communication is fundamental, a main pillar in that governance.
Understood.
And second message I want to say that from our side as the Assad Group, we are bringing and working for a long term to have enable latest capabilities. The one you're having in a normal terrestrial to have it in the satellite. Everybody now is investing in space and satellite.
Right.
And very soon you will hear a lot of news from Yasat Group. I told you about the Earth observation.
Right.
Our T4, inshallah, it will be
Inshallah.
in space very soon.
Okay.
So we are evolving and the
exciting.
space sector is evolving.
That's
Thank you.
really, really exciting, Khalid. Of course, we're all familiar with Yasat, so thank you for taking the time today. David.
100% agreed with what was just said. We're living in this incredible period of technology, right? Just walking around this hub here, it's bananas what we can do now. I can sit here on my phone and tell you how dry the soil in Western Senegal is. I have that app on my phone. It's actually ridiculous, right? So we have these incredible capabilities. The challenge is that information is not yet being packaged in user-friendly ways. So I can understand that because I've been educated on interpreting satellite information systems and it's packaged in my language. Great. But the average farmer in Senegal cannot do that yet. So this is a really important thing. As we get really excited about the technology, we have to make sure we're constantly thinking about how to make sure the right people have the ability to use it. The second thing I'll say is next time, if you invite me back next year, I promise I'll have a robotic arm story for you.
Please.
Yeah,
I mean,
promise.
this is I'm thinking sci-fi, coming in and, so it's really important to have you all talk to those of us that are laymen's to understand, what's going on. We want to talk about the law, I'm with you. We'll do that later. But otherwise, and then last, of course, but not least, Dr. Semia, tell us a little bit about your final thoughts.
No, really picking up from what you both said, reinforcing it's exciting and it's great that we are able to, benefit from such technology, but absolutely, to really localize, contextualize, not just for, obviously, to the front users, to the community, but coming from that research space, education space, and what is needed to really make this effective. There has to be more dialogue or more integration of this language that you said you're familiar with in education, in research, and I think the way we do that is by having these conversations. As you said, this brought
So
three
important.
pieces.
Yeah.
Now I want to learn that language, or really feel how that can be improved so that it can get to the end users and more young people and more in the education system. We bring this into our learnings around.
And middle-aged people are
disaster.
interested in it too. Don't forget us.
I'm just thinking of students that I'm teaching on disaster management. This information needs to be part of that, their learning modules as well.
That's brilliant. I mean, for me, it's always been the half of knowledge is knowing where to find it. Okay, we've got this information, we've got all this open AI, all these things, but that's not, there's the other half, right? Deploying it, understanding it. So these folks, all three of them, it's a very tough job that you all do. but it is truly incredible the way you immerse yourselves and the way lives are saved. Truly, it's not just business, it's literally saving lives. So all three of these folks, I really want to thank you for your time. I know it's a weekend, so thank you so much. And everybody in the audience, thank you.
Thank you
Really.
so much.
Thank you.